Sound is one of the most powerful forces shaping how we feel, remember, and respond, and yet it's often treated as an afterthought. Today's conversation is about changing that. I'm joined by Aifric Lennon, Managing Director at Father, a studio of creative musicians and sound designers working across sonic branding, UI audio, composition, and immersive experiences. Aifric sits at the fascinating intersection between creativity, strategy, and neuroscience. She's studied how sound affects the brain, works with brands on how sound systems scale commercially, and spends a lot of time thinking about when and where sound genuinely adds value and where it's misunderstood. In this episode, we're going to talk about why sound deserves a seat at the strategic table, how brands consistently get it wrong, and why sound plays such a critical role in memory, emotion, and experience, particularly in luxury. Aifric, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Fred. Great to be here.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. I think this is a topic that some people will think sound, there's not much to it. I think others who are a little bit into it realise there's so much more. And first of all, just to start off about it, you're Managing Director at Father, a studio of creative musicians and sound designers. Can you just start by telling us a little bit about your background and how you came to work in sound?
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up in a very musical family, actually. So, you know, my father, my siblings, and actually a lot of my father's family, we were a family of musicians.
No Irish stereotype there at all.
Oh, yeah, we are. I have to say, they're probably the ultimate Irish stereotype. Like, it's hilarious. My British husband definitely says that, we really live up to the stereotype. But so grew up in a family of musicians, play the violin and the flute growing up, and I sing as well, and I was always fascinated and truly passionate about music. But in the beginning, I didn't really believe that I could have a career in music beyond kind of being an artist. Yeah. And I was really interested in science, and I actually studied human health and disease, so kind of applied biomedical science, and then planned to become a doctor, but kind of specialised in the area of neuroscience in my kind of final year of my undergrad, and then just became really fascinated by the kind of intersection between music, sound and neuroscience, and how music and sound affects the mind. And that's what led me to kind of actually come to London and study a master's at Goldsmiths in kind of music, mind and brain. So understanding how music affects our behaviour, our cognition. And from there, could have pursued a career in academia, but kind of realised pretty quickly that, you know, I might end up being a little bit lonely and kind of obsessing over very kind of small but important kind of research questions. And I was really passionate about seeing how I could apply the academia or the science of sound in a more real world environment. And that's what led me to sonic branding and to the world of kind of music, sound and brands. So yeah, I've been working in this industry now for almost 10 years, and spent many years kind of in a strategic role, so heading up kind of strategy at a previous agency, working with brands such as TikTok, O2 here in the UK, many different automotive brands, and really thinking about how sound can be used as a strategic asset to really think about building brands, building emotion and memory. And then, as you've just mentioned, joined Father about 6 months ago now as Managing Director. So Father is a full service music and sound design studio founded by Freddie Webb and Joe Farley. And we specialise in helping brands use music and sound more creatively and in more of an impactful way. And as you mentioned, our work with brands and music spans across lots of different areas, everything from composing music for film to actually, devising the sound of physical environments. So actually composing scores for physical environments. It can also mean developing full scale sonic identity. So thinking about how might we create a system of sound that can be used across a brand's entire kind of ecosystem. So it's really thinking about sound as a strategic asset that can be deployed across an entire brand experience. Yeah.
And I'd love to come back a little bit later in this conversation to the science of sound. But just on sonic branding, I suppose I'd love to know, when did it become a thing? I mean, I suppose in one sense, lots of people would see a score by Hans Zimmer or John Williams or whoever from from way back and would understand how important it is for a medium like film. But when did it become a thing in more mainstream kind of commercial applications or in other mediums?
So I guess, there is a kind of quite a long history to it. And I think the first kind of known example of the original kind of jingle, as you would have called it, actually was an example where Wheaties, the cereal brand, launched a jingle as part of their radio campaign. And I'm going to kind of get the date wrong now. I think it was back in the kind of maybe the 1920s, something like that. But I can, we can double check that one. But they launched a jingle to try and improve sales of Wheaties, and actually had great success with that way back when. And then we kind of went through an era of kind of jingles being the kind of go-to, and then that very much fell out of fashion. I would say, probably one of the most notable, more modern day examples of sonic branding, you might think of the likes of kind of the Intel Inside, Sonic logo, or even the kind of McDonald's. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba, I'm not going to sing it. McDonald's is kind of over 20 years old now. So sonic branding is not something new. I think what's probably new and more recent is brands starting to think beyond, a singular asset, and brands who are starting to think about really creating sonic experiences and thinking much more holistically about how their brand is experienced audibly. And I think that's probably particularly important and interesting when we think about sound in the luxury space as well.
Yeah, and can you talk through just an example or two of something you've been involved with, which is maybe not that obvious or is maybe pushing the barriers a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, even quite recently. So just recently, actually, we've been working really closely with the V&A, the V&A museum here, Victoria and Albert Museum here in London, to actually support with scoring some of their exhibitions. And that's been a really incredible experience to think about actually what is the sound of, an experience when you're kind of visiting their exhibitions. We recently scored the Marie Antoinette style exhibition and created an entire sound world for that to kind of take you through that experience. We also just launched the sound of O2 here in the UK, and that's going to be rolled out globally. And that sonic identity is a really great example of a system where, we're not just thinking about the sound of the logo you hear at the end of their ad. We have developed long form music that can be used for O2's customer service experience. We're also thinking about how the sonic identity can actually be rolled out across O2's sponsorship. So whether that's at the O2 Arena or thinking, beyond to their retail environments as well. So that's a really exciting. And then more recently, we've been working with an automotive brand to actually score the sound that they're creating at Milan Design Week. So creating a holistic sonic experience for that brand there as well. And
so when I suppose for those of us whose head is not in this every day, we can imagine a process whereby there's someone as a musician and there's Pro Tools and a synthesizer, whatever, and you're there composing a score. But obviously there's so much more to that. And especially as we go into the more experiential side of luxury and hotels, or like you said, the V&A, the Marie Antoinette exhibition. What's the process and where does sort of science begin to, or data or process begin to change it from a musician with Pro Tools into something much deeper?
Yeah, really great question. So I think, that early kind of discovery and define process is really crucial to the success of any project that we work on. And I think, some of the things that we would start to look at as we start to kind of bring science and kind of strategic thinking into our creative delivery would be, especially for physical environments, thinking about kind of mapping out that customer journey, that customer experience, thinking about where is that brand showing up and being heard. And, on a top level there, we're thinking about, okay, what sounds might we want to create? That's very obvious. But then if we start thinking a little bit deeper, we're understanding, well, what is the mindset of our consumers in each of those at each of those touch points, and therefore how should we be considering either the structure or the timbre or the emotion that we're trying to land with that specific sound. So for example, we might think about okay, does the brand have a physical space? And if so, how might consumers be feeling when they are interacting with that physical environment, and how might sound and music kind of complement that experience versus, maybe creating sounds for the same brand for their advertising or for an app. How might we start to craft sounds in a way that would really kind of suit that environment? Another thing that we'll start to think about is understanding the kind of white space. So understanding the competitive landscape. We often do a pretty in-depth audit into other brands in the sector and how they're sounding, to really start to think about carving out a distinctive kind of white space for that brand in audio.
So in that sense, it's very like linear, for want of a better word, branding, is that distinctiveness is important. That's one way you could measure success, is it distinct? Yeah.
Absolutely. And you'd be surprised once you kind of dig into the research and the data, just how many sectors fall into a trope and actually, sound very similar. Because if you imagine, in any sector, and let's take luxury as a perfect example, there are often, similar audiences and sometimes similar goals, and it can, without a really kind of distinctive and bespoke strategy in place for that brand, it's very easy to start to kind of fall into musical and sonic tropes. So we would really look at what's happening in sector, but also what's happening out of sector. Are there brands that are not direct competitors that we can actually take inspiration from? How might we start to kind of really carve out an aesthetic or a creative direction that can really land and as you say, feel very distinctive. I think another thing that we often turn to, you mentioned kind of bringing the science into the process, is looking at kind of when we start to coalesce around maybe a creative direction for that brand and sound. It's often really exciting to look at academic research as well. We recently worked on a project where we were looking at, decoding the sound of black and the sound of specific colours, and how might we think about drawing on kind of academic research or scientific research to start to kind of bring that into our creative process as well.
Yeah.
So that kind of discover and define phase is all about drawing on, insights from the brand and its kind of customer journey, insights from the landscape and the sector to start to understand where might we carve out a white space, insights around the audience, who are we actually creating this sound or music for, and how might they what kind of behaviors or kind of headspace might they be in when they're going to be interacting with this sound, and then pulling all of that together into a what's hopefully a really strong creative narrative. We've found that when it comes to kind of getting into the studio and composing, the best work really comes from a really just kind of stems when you have a really strong kind of core creative narrative that we can always come back to, because music can be really, really subjective, and it can be really actually quite a challenging process to get decisions made about music, when often most people who are reviewing music are kind of thinking about maybe their own favorite genres or favorite artists, and so bringing that kind of strong creative positioning into the process is a great way of trying to kind of keep subjectivity at bay as well.
I won't mention Marie Antoinette around. I think it's that your point about subjectivity and objectivity is a really good one. And I suppose that, again, this applies to other mediums or art forms. What are the data points, or what are the ways that you can be less subjective and more objective about a solution that I guess impacts the audience or creates brand affinity or improves the experience?
Yeah, so that there are definitely some key ways in which we can objectively measure or evaluate work, and that we often try and kind of help our clients kind of work through as well as they're evaluating work. And so some of the key things would be thinking about initially the kind of brand identity and how the music or sound solution is helping to express that. So often what we'll look at initially is understanding, what is the brand's kind of core, whether it's personality or identity, and how might we start to translate those attributes into traits that make sense musically. And the idea of creating something that feels truly brand fitting or feels like it's truly expressing the brand is something that is, really, really important. So that would be one really important factor. I think secondly, measuring kind of distinctiveness. Again, does it sound and feel fresh and not like the category? And often we'll have walked the client through the process of understanding what the category tropes are. So ideally by that point, and usually by that point, the client is
They're
able
also
to...
hunting for that white space like you are.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And then,
Are they sometimes surprised that those tropes exist? Do they know that that's the thing?
Often they're really surprised. And sometimes, I think because we're doing this at Father, we're doing this day in, day out. Sometimes you kind of get in a bit of an echo chamber and you kind of feel like, well, surely what we're sharing with the client about their category, they'll already know. But often our clients will know their category inside out, of course, from at a brand level and often at a visual level. But it's surprising how many clients haven't thought about what their category sounds like. So it is usually a surprise to clients that those kind of tropes that come through.
Is it ever a case where actually distinctiveness is a bad thing and that you actually want to follow the trope because people associate it with a certain quality or perceive it as something that they're used to?
Yeah, I think it's a fine balance, and it's definitely, there is definitely a kind of a narrow or happy medium in terms of, of course you want to bring in a little bit of freshness and kind of incongruence, but you don't want to, for example, you wouldn't want to create the sound of a bank that was in a genre that was completely off kilter with the audience of that or the content that bank was sharing. So I think the way that we always try and look at it is, how do we make sure that we are kind of both brand aligned, audience aligned, kind of content or narrative aligned and distinctive, and if any of those things are off, if you're kind of flowing too far into the kind of distinctive space while completely ignoring your audience or the content that you're actually looking to score, then that can become problematic. But that just right amount of incongruence is something that can be really, really powerful. And actually, there was a study that I led on. It was, part of my previous work that I did with my previous agency, but it launched this year. It was with the IPA, the Practitioner of Advertisers here in the UK. And it was the first study of its kind where we actually looked at kind of isolating the impact of music in advertising and linking it to real kind of ROI and sales data via the IPA, which is really, really exciting. And one of the factors that we looked at measuring in music was music that was kind of incongruent or surprising in a positive way. Of course, you never want music to be incongruent in a jarring way. Yeah. But what we found was that brands using music that was surprising or original or distinctive were driving significant uplift in brand fame. And actually that kind of fame effect, we know it can be a really powerful kind of precursor of other sales effects as well. So we know that being brave enough to choose something that, or to create something that feels, maybe surprising or distinctive for your category, can be a really powerful driver. Yeah.
And I guess there must be an ecosystem of sort of surveys and focus groups or ways that you measure this, whereby you're getting people in for sampling people and etc.
Yeah, so the methodology that we used for the IPA report is actually the same methodology, or a very analogous methodology to what we use at Father when we look at testing our work, which we do often, especially for sonic branding projects. And it's actually, we work with an amazing partner called Cloud Army, who specialise in what we call kind of implicit or intuitive research, where we actually, rather than kind of focus groups or kind of traditional written surveys, we actually ask respondents to listen to the audio and then very quickly react and kind of sort emotions and traits relative to that audio. So what we're kind of trying to do there is understand not only if people think if people think something is innovative, but actually if they feel intuitively, emotionally drawn to that music. And we're capturing that through online surveys, but in a much more comprehensive way, I would say, than kind of your traditional surveys. And we know that implicit research is by far the most powerful way of understanding and measuring the impact of audio, because quite a subliminal asset and not something that we can kind of easily rationalize.
Yes.
So, yeah.
And can you talk about when sound in the creative process, especially for creating a brand, which is obviously quite a lot of what Matter of Form would do, how early on in the process should it come? I'm guessing quite often the time brand creation, less so advertising, it's an afterthought.
Yes, more often than not, sound is an afterthought. And I would say, this seems like a very obvious answer, but the earlier you can consider sound, the better. I think, we've been brought in on music and sound briefs at all stages of the process, right from, we're working right now actually on a brief for a brand that is for a product that's actually just being created. So we're being brought in really, really early in that process, which is amazing. I will say that while we can work at all stages of development of either a brand or a product, having something to respond to can often be helpful. Having, whether it's even just, some early visuals or having kind of a brand strategy locked in place. Or at least the early stages of positioning can usually be really helpful for us to have something to respond to. But, we have worked on briefs where actually sound has led to that as well. So, I think we can come in at any stage, but having something to respond to can be useful for us.
Yeah. And how does sound, luxury podcast, how do you think sound should express itself in luxury? That's a huge question. I get it. There's mainstream advertising, there's mainstream brands, but in luxury where it's more experiential, it's high touch, it's more nuanced. How should sound be used? And how does that affect the experience? It affect the commercials?
Absolutely. I think when it comes to luxury, and you look at the kind of differences between sound's role maybe in luxury versus kind of mainstream branding, I think one big difference is the lever that sound and music should play when it comes to kind of emotion, meaning and memory. For luxury brands, I think is really, really important. Where mainstream brands are really focusing on kind of using sound maybe as a pure recall device, I think where we start to think about sound and music in luxury space, the ability that it has to kind of build and drive emotion and drive kind of brand perception and drive value over time, I think is particularly important. There's some really interesting research which found that consistent use of sound can actually increase the perceived value of a brand by between, I think, 5 and 10%, which is a small amount, but actually, over time.
Yeah.
And when we're thinking about luxury brands, actually, that could be quite significant. So that's kind of broad strokes. And then thinking about sound's role when it comes to kind of experiential in the luxury space, I think what we're seeing more and more of now is that sound is not just there to be a kind of a decorative add-on or even just a branding tool. How can we think about sound as actually a driver of experience and well-being as well? I think the ability for the right sound and music to actually support well-being of customers and consumers in physical environments, I think is a really, really interesting space to explore and thinking about how sound can have that dual purpose. It doesn't have to be an either or. It doesn't have to be either a kind of brand lever or a well-being device. It can be both. Which
in the hotel context, obviously, it's an expression of almost nearly everything that we as humans are about, from waking up to sleep to socializing to food to quiet time, all that wellness.
Yeah.
And so where are we going just beyond the obvious of a sort of soundtrack or a Spotify playlist? How is it affecting those different areas?
Yeah, I think it's thinking about, even thinking about the role of silence. How can we consider the acoustic design of environments for consumers in kind of luxury environments? How can we use sound as a way of kind of actually creating really serene environments, and if that means using silence or using the absence of sound or the blocking out of noise, I think can be a really powerful consideration. And then also thinking about kind of personalization. So as you say, kind of thinking beyond just, what's the playlist playing in the reception area, or how can you start to consider whether there are kind of personalized experience for example, in your own hotel room, or, even in kind of spa wellness areas. And I'm not just talking about kind of spa music and kind of the usual generic experience that we all have, but how can we start to actually allow personalization to kind of come into play here as well?
Just in terms of more generally what you do you ever worry that AI can create, and I'm sure it does, these models whereby you can almost specify the inputs and it will come with the outputs almost immediately? Or do you think the human intermediary will always be needed in this industry or this endeavor?
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think we would be wild, or we would definitely be a bit crazy not to be worrying about AI in the creative industry. And I think it's definitely, every day there are new tools landing and there are kind of updates happening, and these tools are kind of just constantly improving. So yes, of course, there are some concerns there, but I think, I did a little bit of research into this recently for a piece of work I was doing. And what's really interesting about the rise of kind of generative audio and generative kind of creation of music is that although it's kind of reaching this point of almost saturation and it's becoming better and better every day, actually what we know is that there is almost an increased desire from consumers for that kind of level of artistry and for an understanding that there is a real artist and human behind the work. And also consumers are getting much better at recognizing, especially with visual AI, I think, when something is feeling like it's been AI generated. The way that we at Father are kind of navigating this, I think, is like understanding that there will always be, I guess, for a lower tier of content, there will always be brands who don't have that value for music and sound and who choose to kind of use generative AI music, potentially, whether that's in their reception or, otherwise. Especially, I think, in the luxury space, what we're seeing is more and more brands actually kind of almost kind of wanting the antithesis of that, really wanting to turn to human craft and to really know who are the people behind the music that they are using. And with Father being a very kind of artistry-led and craft-led business, actually what we're seeing is that the clients we're working with are wanting to lean into that even more. Now that there is such an abundance of kind of noise and kind of AI slop out there when it comes to music.
Yes, and you could have similar outputs, but I think that's the thing in the luxury space, is that the storytelling in the craft of how it came about is as important as anything.
100%. And actually, we did a study, or I worked on a study a few months ago, or about a year ago now, where we measured, using that same intuitive association testing, we measured, it was a really interesting study actually, the perception of a film or an advertising film dependent on the type of music that was used. So we compared a number of different AI generated tracks, and compared that with bespoke compositions, commercial music licensing, and some stock music. The results were really interesting, and what we found was that even though consumers weren't very good at picking out which music was AI generated versus originally composed or even commercially licensed, the results when it came to brand perception and emotional engagement were drastically different. So the AI music was significantly less good at actually expressing emotion and expressing kind of brand identity. So that was quite interesting. So even though maybe it's hard for us to decipher what music is AI generated versus original, consumers are kind of implicitly not feeling as moved or connected to it.
Which speaks to something really profound in there, which we probably don't understand, but that's fascinating. I suppose actually first of all, what's your definition of luxury in the sound sphere? What does it mean to you?
I would say luxury in the sound sphere is something that feels very, very considered. It's sound that can, really envelop you, really take you on a journey, and can really feel, highly kind of accustomed to that brand and to that brand's audience as well.
Yeah. Do you think luxury brands are ahead of the curve or behind the curve when it comes to thinking properly about sound and implementing it?
I think it varies, as with any kind of sector does, I think. But I would say that actually most sectors are behind the curve when it comes to using sound strategically, and I would include luxury in that. I think there are a few kind of luxury brands who are using, and there are a few examples of luxury brands using music well in advertising. But when we start to then think beyond the obvious touch points like TV and social and AV in general, we that's where we start to kind of lose. That's where I think brands are falling down. So, yeah.
And I've got one last question before we go to the usual outro questions. Just some advice for people listening to this who work in brands. If there's one place where you think brands should start taking sound seriously immediately, one decision, one moment, one touch point, where should they look?
Yeah, this is a very tricky question because I think it does depend on the brand. But I think it would probably be wrong of me to say every brand should start here, because every brand is on a different journey and has different objectives. But I would say think about your highest exposure, highest impact touch points. Think about, and that's not going to necessarily be the same for every brand. And start there. And don't be afraid to start small. Don't feel like, I think sometimes brands can feel a little bit overwhelmed with the idea of sonic branding and needing to create an entire sound world and invest time and money into creating sound for every single part of their journey. It doesn't have to be that way. I think about your highest impact touch point, whether that's starting with social or starting with your physical space, or thinking about actually creating the sound of your product, whether that if that's a physical or digital product. So be kind of brave enough to be able to start somewhere and kind of work out from there, I would say.
And I've learned also from this conversation that silence is an option, that the lack of sound in a world where we're saturated with notifications and noise everywhere, perhaps in a way we weren't 50 years ago, that you can be creative about not using sound. It's not as linear as always having sound everywhere.
100%. That especially, that's especially the case when we think about, as you say, this kind of saturated media landscape. We are exposed to just such a myriad of sounds kind of from the moment we wake up in the morning until when we rest our heads at night. So how can we create moments of calm and quiet for our consumers as well, and how can we do that through sound? And whether that's creating space for silence or even considering a soundscape that maybe is designed to kind of calm and create that moment of reprise for our consumers, I think is definitely something that I would advocate for.
Yeah. Aifric, thank you. Now we subject everyone sitting in your seat to the same 4 questions at the end of the podcast, and you'll be delighted to know we're not going to treat you any differently. The first question is, what would you most like to change about your industry?
I mean, this might seem like a very obvious one, but I can't leave without saying it. I think I would love to continue to try and change perceptions about the role that sound can play for brands, for experiences, for consumers. So, I think it's a kind of grossly undervalued medium, and I would love to continue to kind of educate and change perception around sound's role in our industry.
Yeah. A slightly different second question. What most concerns you about the world we're leaving the next generation?
Yeah, this one is deep. Yeah, I would say that there are a lot of things that concern me, unfortunately, at the moment, because we're living in quite turbulent times, aren't we?
It's a bad week to ask, given geopolitics, but yes.
Yeah, I think, I guess probably my biggest concern would be, that loss of connection, the transition towards kind of the world we're living in, and social media and just how kind of disconnected we have all become is something that does, I do worry about for the future and for the next generation. How will we find or kind of rediscover human connection and being part of community, and how might we think about trying to salvage some of that in the future, I think is something I'm concerned about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you had to give up your job tomorrow, you can't have anything to do with sound, sonic branding, anything like that, what would you do?
I think it would require a bit more study, but I think I probably would go back into medicine and explore that passion some more. I love people, and I think and I love science, so probably something in that space. Yeah.
And finally, what's the most exciting thing for you in the next 5 years?
I'm really excited about Father's Journey. We're at a bit of an exciting moment as a business, and we're growing, and I'm really, really excited over the next 5 years to kind of hopefully continue working with some incredible clients. Continue to kind of hopefully push boundaries when it comes to kind of creating sound that feels distinctive and feels differentiated in the category that we're in.
Aifric, thank you so much for coming in today for that brilliant conversation and educating us a little bit on that topic.
Thanks so much, Fred. Great to be here.